All right. Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you, Russ, for having me. Good evening, everyone. It is such a joy to hear from all of you earlier, or I guess some of you earlier, and just to see your beautiful faces. So happy Pride Month, to all of you, and happy almost Juneteenth for those of you in the American continent. It is just so good and such an honor to be with you all, in this virtual space of prayer and learning. And today I am absolutely delighted to think with you about saints and holy people from a queer Catholic perspective. So before I go any further, I'm going to remember to share my screen because I have some slides. If you can't, or like if you're, in the middle of driving or something, don't worry about it. They're important, but I will cover most of them as I talk as well. Yeah, so the title of my talk is Queer Saints and Ancestors, Spiritual Practices of Recovery and Imagination. Here is how our time together is going to go, just so you know. The first part of our time together, I will be doing most of the talking. We will spend some time with the very complex Catholic concept of saints. Yeah, and we will think about some images and icons of how queer people within the Catholic tradition and other marginalized people have retrieved spiritualities of saints for themselves in a way that draws from the richness of the Catholic imagination. And then for the last little short part of all of this, we are going to try to put this into practice as I guide us through a very short reflective ritual so that we can pray and reflect together. And don't worry, there's no audience participation required. It is always welcome. You are free to keep your videos on or off for any and all parts of this whole talk, as well as the ritual. So whatever that you feel comfortable with. Yeah, so let me begin with my story. A couple years ago, my queer Catholic community's Easter Vigil liturgy, like most other Easter Vigil liturgies in the Catholic tradition, includes a plain chant litany of saints, an ancient Christian tradition that invokes saints and angels by name and asks for their intercession on behalf of the praying community. I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with this. But in lieu of Peter and Paul, Augustine and Athanasius, our litany of saints invoked the names of Perpetual and Felicity, Sergius and Bacchus, Joan of Arc, Sebastian, and the like. Queer saints, if you may. So for the few heterosexual participants of our liturgy who are not quote unquote in the know, our queer litany of saints is just another, albeit very peculiar, selective list of saints drawn from the ever lengthier list of canonized Catholic saints. Aside from eternal salvation in heaven, no big deal, there is nothing too remarkable about them. But the queer Catholics who attend our liturgy knows that these saints, whom we are asking to pray for us, are in our imagination and our history, are considered as queer. And if you're thinking right now, what are you talking about, Flora? Hear me out here. While we can never claim to know the sexualities or romantic lives of the saints, there are some saints and holy people from the Catholic tradition and the wider Christian tradition, canonized or otherwise, who are unofficially but popularly labeled as queer. And we as queer Catholics make a choice about narrating their stories as one that we interpret as queer, knowing that we can never know for sure the sexualities or inner lives of anyone, let alone in saints. These queer saints include some of the ones that I've listed above, but also many more whose story we'll explore today. Queer people turn to these saints as friends, as companions in the journey, and as ancestors in our faith who are interceding for us. And as we will discuss in our talk today, it is not just queer Catholics who are reimagining the saints. Many other marginalized groups, from women, people of color, and beyond, have also reimagined the saints and their stories in ways that nourish our faith and our survival in the church. We will also talk about, how these practices of reimagining the saints' stories is not the same as making things up out of thin air, but rather a practice of deep faith. To do so, let's first think about theologically for a little bit. about why we, in particular, as women, as feminists, as people who long for a better church, venerate saints in the first place. So since the early church's veneration of martyrs, Christian communities have lifted up and venerated the dead within their local communities and beyond, whom they considered as holy. Early Christians prayed at the tombs of martyrs, while Christians throughout the ages have developed their own local forms of devotions to Mary, among many others. The Catholic Church's Second Vatican Council document, Lumen Gentium, writes that we seek from the saints example in their way of life, fellowship in their communion, and aid by their intercession. Feminist theologians, such as Elizabeth Johnson, who we'll see right here, thinks that this model of thinking about why many of us across different histories and cultures are drawn to the saints is good. Like what Vatican says is good, but it's not the entire story. Our church's relationship to the veneration of saints have long been contested. So practices surrounding saints veneration, especially before the Reformation, has often led to monetized indulgences and financial abuses by church leadership. Bishops and local elites fought over control of important martyrs' gravesites. Today, many practices surrounding saints could also easily become just a little bit idolatrous or monetized. When pilgrims associate touching a saint's gravesite or relic or purchasing holy water from a sacred object from a site as an act that may lead to miraculous healing. The saints themselves, too, have had their controversies. So we've had quite a few North American saints who are remembered by Indigenous and Black communities as their colonizers, right? These are European saints who are colonizers, missionaries, and possibly even enslavers. We have other saints who have killed many during times of war. And overall, if you look at the list of saints who are canonized in the Catholic Church and remembered by name, most of them are still, as much as we try to canonize more diverse saints, they're still male, they're still predominantly clergy or priests, they're still predominantly celibate, European, and white, which hardly reflect the global diversity or the gender and vocational diversity of the Church. This is all to say that the category of saints is flawed and complicated. And sometimes the traditional way of thinking about our relationship to the saints are less than helpful for people on the margins of the Catholic tradition. Far too many female saints, for instance, hold the very complicated and icky title of virgin, including Saints Maria Goretti and Agnes, who are 12 and 13-year-old children who are somehow celebrated by the Church for choosing death over, quote unquote, losing their virginity during circumstances of sexual assault. Indigenous saints and saints of color, who are already far and few between, have often been narrated by the Church as people who chose Christianity over and against their own communities or traditional religions. Those who resisted colonization, those who fought against slavery, and those who refused to participate in institutions of violence, or women who resisted against the patriarchal nature of the Church, are rarely celebrated, at least in official narratives. Many saints of color are commemorated by the Church in ways that coincide with their stereotyped racial narratives. Most, if not all, East Asian women saints, for example, are martyrs who have been passively killed by what the Church deems as evil Asian men, which further perpetuates an Orientalist stereotype that women of color must be saved from their own cultures and societies. I, as an Asian woman, for example, found very little hope and little desire to emulate these obscure and nameless saints who are only known for their quiet deaths. This is all to say the saints, especially according to the official Catholic imagination, have failed us. The official canon of saints and the limits of their stories in the Church's narration have failed all of us here. The saints have failed us as queer people, as people of color, as women, and as people with disabilities, and as people who are subversive, and many more. As we searched in the canons of Catholic history for just one holy person who looked like us and could walk with us, but ending up finding very few or none at all. Nonetheless, many of us turn to the saints anyway. Catholic women and queer people have somehow found the saints to be a powerful source of memory, hope, and reclamation of their rightful place in the longer theological tradition. And theologian Elizabeth Johnson here puts words to this phenomenon. She looks at how Catholic women, against the longstanding tradition where popes and theologians have deemed Mary Magdalene as a sinful woman, as a prostitute, have reclaimed and celebrated her as the first proclaimer of God's resurrection. Groups such as the Women's Ordination Conference, whose icon we can see on the left of my screen, has powerfully celebrated St. Mary Magdalene as a preacher, proclaimer, and a beacon of hope. So why do they venerate St. Mary Magdalene? And why do we venerate the saints? Johnson asks, and we ask today. The traditional belief that the saints are somehow closer to God and more powerful in their prayers, as we as ordinary people are somehow less powerful in our prayers, perpetuates the clerical, gendered, and moral hierarchy present in the Catholic Church. For many of us, that is not why we celebrate the saints. But rather, Johnson writes, we venerate the saints and honor them because we are asking the saints to walk with us as friends and companions on our journey, which draws a little bit from the title of her book on saints. In this theology of sainthood, all Christians and all God's people, living and dead, are in one circle of friendship centered around God's grace. The saints are in the circle of friendship with God alongside us, walking with us as partners in hope and solidarity. In the practices of women preachers and women priests who celebrate St. Mary Magdalene, or in the practice of Black women who honor the witness of biblical Hagar, or based communities in Latin America who honor Oscar Romero or their own martyrs, Christians reclaim saints as partners in the struggle against an oppression that is analyzed in explicitly socio-political terms. These renewed and sometimes re-remembered memories of the saints is a challenge to action, a call for hope, and an uncovering of previously silenced voices. So I think this is why we venerate the saints. We venerate saints to find traces of our own presence in the Christian tradition, especially when this presence of women and of queer people are often submerged intentionally by the systems of heteropatriarchal power at play. Sometimes this involves with creative practices of imagination of our presence in history, coupled by a deep mourning of our real absence, so that new histories and hagiographies can be narrated and remembered. So part 2. So we're gonna think about some queer saints together. So yeah, for queer people, there has been a long and subversive history of reclaiming saints for our own. In this part, I will very briefly tell you about some of them. And the point of me telling about them is not just to tell you who they are, but also so that we can together think of what the very practices of reimagining their stories and remembering them as saints and holy people might look like. So no matter what gender or sexuality or race and religious background that you here identify as, so as you listen to these stories and practices, think of how these practices of retrieval, of reimagination, might feel familiar to you or might be helpful to you. Even if these particular saints and holy people are either not familiar to you or not super relevant to you, think of how you have navigated similar stories in your spiritual practices. Maybe from a Black Catholic perspective, or maybe from a perspective of a mother, and etc. At the end of my talk, I'd love to hear from you on how these practices and images have resonated with you, and whether there are saints and holy people that you feel particularly drawn to as well. So we began with historical and canonized saints. A pair of saints that are often invoked at queer weddings as an example of love and fidelity between people of the same sex is Saints Perpetual and Felicity, 2nd century martyrs. So as Brother Robert Lunt, who is the iconographer of this particular icon that we see on the left side of my screen, writes of them, quote, Perpetua mentions in her diary that those arrested with her were a slave named Felicity and 3 men, Saturninus, Secundulus, and Revocatus. She details the misery of their cell, the efforts her father made to persuade her to recant, the naming of her family members, everyone who helped the martyrs and those who condemned them. One person conspicuous in not being mentioned was her husband. As a noblewoman, she would have been married, but for whatever reason, he was not there for her, when one would think that he would have been the most needed. The person that was there for her was Felicity. Before being martyred, they gave each other the kiss of peace and held on to one another during the final moments of their lives. Perpetual and Felicity have since then been commemorated by many not only for their deep Christian faith in the face of adversity and Roman persecution, but also for the deep bond of friendship and love that lie between the two. Now, the only source that we have about the two saints' lives come from Perpetua's diary in an eyewitness narrative of the martyrdom, nothing more. We do not know what sexualities these second-century martyrs are. We also know that sexualities as we know of it today did not exist back then. And we cannot or should not claim to know for certain their romantic lives or inner desires. This means that we do not know for certain whether they or any saints or anyone, for that matter, are queer. But also, we do not claim for certain or presume too that any canonized saint is also necessarily heterosexual. And that would be the definition of the word heteronormativity. However, the two saints' connections to one another and their love for one another, even until death, have allowed people to venerate them, to imagine and say, perhaps their love for one another is a sign that holiness can too be present in the love between these two women. Since then, queer Christian women have displayed their icons at LGBTQ masses, at queer weddings, as a veneration of their holy presence, and as a way to remember that perhaps queer presence has always somehow been there in the history of our church. But at the same time that we imagine with hope that yes, there has been queer women in the history of our church and in the communion of saints, we also mourn the fact that their stories has never been truly visible. And now we have to read between the lines to really imagine and reinvent stories in order to even find a tiny trace of possible subversive queerness, because any openly queer stories would have been erased by those in power. In remembering them as queer saints, we also hold with grief that the queerness of this story may actually not be possible at all under these structures of slavery and domination, given that Perpetua was a noblewoman and Felicity was an enslaved person at her time. So we hold all these contentious stories in tension with one another as we imagine a possible queer past. Nonetheless, their love and fidelity for God and for one another and to death points to just a hint of queer possibility in the larger Christian narrative, where heterosexuality and opposite gender relationships seem like the only option in the norm. Another saint that is commonly imagined by people today as queer is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, as many of us are familiar, was not only known for her heroic act of leading her French people during battle, but also for her desire to dress in male clothing and armor and cutting her hair short. In contrast with the usual tenderness of many female saints, at least in the ways that they're portrayed, Joan of Arc's image, as you see here, offered a very different and much needed vision of a different sense of femininity. Many genderqueer and transgender Catholics today venerate Joan of Arc as a saint that transgresses gender norms. Obviously, again, we do not know Joan of Arc's gender identities, and these concepts do not exist at all back in medieval France. However, her defiance of gender norms that existed back then offers some hope to us that there is a saint that walks with us in our transgressions of gender norms and of binary gender identities. As many of us know, Joan of Arc, now a canonized saint in the Catholic Church, also died at the hands of the Roman Catholic Church authorities in 1431 at age 19, and she was burned at the stake for heresy. Joan's death and persecution by the church also echoed the experience of many queer Catholics who likewise experienced rejection and sometimes physical and spiritual harm by the institutional church. However, Joan's very much belated canonization as a saint gives us some hope that the very church that today rejects us might one day also celebrate us and recognize us for who we are. We also recognize that because of the limits surrounding the rules of canonization, only a select few holy people have been officially canonized by the Catholic Church. Many others, including holy people and ancestors from more recent time periods, do not fit the Church's criteria for canonization, perhaps because they're openly queer, perhaps because they're in a gay relationship, or because they're not Catholic. But queer people can still hold these holy people in our prayers and remembrances and consider them as saints, perhaps in the lowercase sense, or as holy people, ancestors, or whatever descriptors you choose as you ask them to walk along with us. And I think one example that came to mind that echoes the story of Joan of Arc is this recently painted icon of Alana Chen by Father William Hart McNichols, who he himself is an openly gay priest and iconographer who ministered alongside HIV/AIDS patients in the 1980s. Alana was a young Asian American Catholic woman who lived in Colorado. At a young age, she notices that she was attracted to women and told her priest about it during confessions. The priest told her to withhold this information from her parents and proceeded to recommend her various anti-gay pastoral counsel sessions and sessions that are akin or is conversion therapy. After several hospitalizations, Alana died by suicide in 2019. And her story, which is told through her own journals and her mother's narration, are brought to light today through various news articles, as well as through a 2023 podcast series titled Dear Alana. In response to the podcast, Father McNichols painted this icon of Alana with Our Lady of Sorrows on her upper right side, watching over her and bringing her home. Alana's story, similar to St. Joan of Arc, tells of a church that condemns some people to death for their queerness or nonconformity. So in recognizing her holiness through portraying her in the form of an iconography, we remember and mourn the holy lives lost to homophobia, to conversion therapy, and to all forms of hatred that wounds and kills. Alana's story also reminds me of the more wider known story of Matthew Shepard, here portrayed on the left in this icon by Kelly Latimore, and then on the right, or top right, in an icon entitled The Passion of Matthew Shepard by Father William Hart McNichols. So the left icon is currently hanging inside the Episcopal Washington National Cathedral, where Matthew is buried. So Matthew Shepard, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a gay young man who was walking alone at night and was beaten to death in 1998, alongside another young Black trans man who was also beaten to death. And he is often commemorated in queer liturgies and in the prayer lives of LGBTQ people as someone who has been killed because of his queer identity. And as we see in the top icon, painted once again by Father McNichols, Matthew Shepard's death is sometimes compared in some way to a crucifixion of an innocent victim at the hands of those who are in power. But we also, as much as we recognize these folks as holy people, as people that we paint icons for or of, we also there's also a really big message of caution, right? We many times in popular culture and media, there's still many tropes surrounding where death and suffering are somehow the only ending for queer characters. If you Google the term "bury your gays" on Google, that's a trope. So if you want statistics on how disproportionately many openly gay characters die or are killed in TV shows and movies, that's something that's been studied by many scholars to think of how or why queer death is somehow the only ending that is offered to queer characters in movies and TV shows. And similarly, in our own Christian theology, we also have a long history of over-glorifying human suffering, right? We as Catholics tend to see suffering as good. We see suffering as holy, or as something that brings us closer to God. And that has done a lot of harm throughout church history to tell oppressed people that, maybe suffering or even death is either a good ending for them or it's the natural ending. So in venerating and remembering these saints and holy people who have died unjustly because of their queerness. We must also remember not to put their deaths and suffering on a pedestal. We must remember that God does not want them to suffer. God did not want them to die. And similarly, God does not want us to suffer. And God does not want queer people in general to suffer or to be in pain or to die under unjust circumstances. So as we name these people as holy people, as saints, we seek not to emulate their deaths, but rather we lament the unjust death of these holy queer people. And through their deaths, and lamenting that injustice, we hope and work and resist for a future that is different from this current climate of prevailing queer death and homophobic violence. So speaking of resistance, one such holy person who is known for her resistance and persistence is Marsha P Johnson. So we see her face on the left icon on a votive candle. And on the right is an image of her in her full glory and beauty. And in doing so, right, we expand the canon of saints and call on the prayers and presence of queer ancestors such as Marsha P Johnson through, either painting her in icons or putting her face on the votive candle or just invoking her name as we're living our lives and praying. So Marsha P Johnson is a Black trans woman who was instrumental in the Stonewall Rebellions of 1969, where queer people, many of whom trans people of color like Johnson, resisted police violence against them. She is also one of the co-founders of an organization, where she was, she passed away, that serves homeless queer people and trans youth, reminding us that queer liberation goes hand in hand with racial justice, with care for the mentally ill, and with alleviating hunger and poverty for those who are in the most need. So in other words, queer issues are not just issues limited to the rights of upper middle class gay white people, but more importantly, for those who are on the margins of society already because of poverty and racism. Many artists have painted icons of Marsha P. Johnson, invoking her presence as the mother of the streets in ways that echo the comforting yet powerfully subversive presence of Mother Mary, who are walking with her queer and trans children today. And these are just a few examples of queer saints throughout our church history and more recent years. Hopefully in all of these saints' stories and in our time together of exploring how people have reimagined their lives and histories to contest with the both invisibility and possibility of queerness throughout history, we can see a lot of ambiguity, contestation, and uncertainty here. Recovering our hagiographies and recovering our histories require us to be bold and imaginative. It requires us to say, despite the lack of, queer evidence in dominant and heterosexist historical archives, to say, yes, we were here. There were queer people here. And at the same time, it requires us to contest with the very real possibility that the systems of power, such as racism, slavery, and militarization, in the lives of the saints and holy people, may in fact have actually precluded authentic queer love and liberation. So we offer and hold no easy answers to the question of, were there queer saints, right? So we mourn at the same time the many queer lives and queer saints whose names and stories may never be known. We mourn the far too many queer people who, rather than being canonized by the church, have been actively condemned. And we mourn the very stark absence of women, of queer people, of people of color in the official memory and list of saints that is given to us by the church. So what I gave you during this talk were not clear answers of which historical figures identified as what sexuality, nor did I, hopefully, tell you one singular model of how to live a queer and holy life. What we did together during this talk instead is to practice how to search for saints and ancestors that speak to our faith and identities, and practice how to read and reread their stories to uncover possibilities of submerged narratives, even if it requires reimagining certain things that might not either be there or might not be visible. These practices of reimagining queer saints are an act of hope and persistence, of mourning and openness. Even if rereading queerness into the story of saints looks like grasping at threads, we continue to imagine and reimagine anyway. Because we pray, we hope, and we believe that, yes, we were there in the history of our church and in the longer history of holiness beyond the church, that we were there and we are still here. So thank you. That concludes the me talking at you portion of my talk. And if we have time, I would love to conclude with a very brief little prayer and ritual. Olivia, is that okay? Okay, awesome. So just so that you're not just like listening to me like ramble on and on. Yeah. And so so to begin our ritual, let us gather our thoughts. I know there's been a lot of thoughts, a lot of me talking. Let's gather all of that gather our feelings, gather our prayers together, and we begin with a moment of quiet. We quiet our hearts and open our heart to God's presence. And for this next part, you are welcome to gently close your eyes if you wish. You can light a candle. You can take out a notebook to jot down your thoughts. You can keep your eyes open if you're driving. Don't close your eyes. And if you have anything you want to share during this ritual, please feel free to share them in the Zoom chat. I can't see them, but because of my computer, but I will see them once I stop screen sharing. So as we're opening our hearts and listening to God's presence, we will begin with a reading from the book of Ruth. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And this is from Ruth 1:15-18. In the book of Ruth, Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law. However, the verse above is frequently read at queer weddings, for it reflects a sense of fidelity, faith, and love between two women during a time of hardship and struggle. Ruth chooses to be with Naomi, to go where she goes, to stay where she stays, even when going with her means little possibility of marriage to a man, and therefore little promise of financial stability. The story of Ruth and Naomi, even if not historically considered as queer, offers queer people today hope and possibility that the vows of fidelity and love between people of the same gender are deemed as holy in God's eyes and a central part of the scriptural lineage of Jesus Christ, our Savior. That the love between these two women during a time when marriage to men were almost essential for survival in the world are indeed enough for their survival. So we're going to listen to this passage again and see if you cling to a particular phrase, character, or sentiment. You don't have to, listen to whatever I just said. Just let the passage take you wherever you want to be. Allow your mind also to wander imaginatively. You can imagine different historical circumstances, different responses, different possibilities, and different motivations. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, and I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. If any thoughts jump out at you, you're always welcome to jot them down or type them in the Zoom chat. Think about, where did your imaginations take you? Who did you relate to in the story? Who did you see yourself as? And if you're willing to go there, what new queer, feminist, or subversive possibilities are present? Take a moment to reflect on those again, jotting them down or sharing them as you wish in the chat, because I can't really see, but it's okay. And now, having reflected on the presence of the saints today, we now turn to a different part of the same passage. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Ruth's words are also words that we pray when we invoke the presence of the saints. Ruth clings to Naomi as a poor woman in a foreign land. And we, as pilgrims on a journey, cling to the presence of queer, feminists, and subversive saints to walk with us during times of loneliness and trial. So now picture yourself saying the words, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Which saint or holy people or ancestor or even family member or friend do you wish to say this to? Or rather, if that's not doing anything for you, picture yourself walking down the line of saints, both capital S saints and lowercase saints, however you wish to define them in our faith tradition. Who do you wish to encounter? What kind of person, experience, identity do you wish to encounter? Perhaps a saint who was a mother of three, perhaps a saint who was exhausted, a saint who struggles with postpartum depression, a saint who is transgender, or a saint who is aging. What kind of saint or holy person do you hope to be walking with you at this moment? And if a particular named person comes to mind, that's great. Dwell on their image for a moment in your imagination. Who are they? Think of how their stories are typically told by those in power. Think of whether you like those stories or whether you want more. Both are totally fine. How might you re-envision their stories? How might you retrieve and reclaim narratives that were submerged? You can be brave here because the sky's the limit. We imagine the possibilities of their stories if and when retold by queer voices and by women's voices. And finally, how might you ask the saint to walk with you today? Or how might you, through your prayers and actions for love and justice, honor this saint in your life? We collect all of our final thoughts and prayers and reflections. And we give thanks to God for the witness of Ruth and Naomi, and for all these saints and holy people whether they're currently in our mind right now, or just those who are in our lives watching over us, even if we can't remember them right now. We give thanks for all those people who walk with us and inspire us in our hope. And finally, I will conclude with a short blessing for all of us gathered here today before we turn over to any questions or comments. Blessed be God. Blessed be God's many names and faces. Blessed be God in the whispering breeze and the blazing flame. Blessed be God, the mother who gave birth to the world and who never fails to listen to the cries of her children. Blessed be God, the Father, who adorns himself in glory and radiance. Blessed be God beyond all genders, God the Mother, Father, and Parent, whose name is simply I am who I am. Blessed be our father Jacob, who wrestles with an angel all night for a blessing. And blessed be our mother Hagar, who sees God in the desert in times of desperation. Blessed be the prophets Elijah and Elisha, who swore to one another the oath of love. As long as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. Blessed be Mary and Martha, partners and sisters, who rested by one another, loving one another from death to resurrection. Blessed be Jesus Christ in the poor, in the marginalized, and in the forgotten queer names and faces. And blessed be the queer spirits, the queer angels, the queer saints, and the queer ancestors, whose intercessions and blessings instill a love within us that transgresses all and consumes all. And blessed are you, and blessed am I, and blessed are you who resist, you who love, you who desire, and you who struggle. And blessed are we, children of God, now and forever. Amen.
Flora, thank you so much for that amazing presentation and that beautiful ritual prayer and blessing. I'm speaking for myself, but maybe for many of those on the Zoom call, if you are willing to share the blessing you just read for us, I'm sure many of us would love to have that, but I certainly would love to be able to turn to that. That was stunning. So thank you so much. Um, I'd love to take the time that we have left to open up to all of you. If anybody has questions or thoughts or comments, you can use the hand raising feature here on Zoom, or feel free to put a question or comment in the chat and I can offer it aloud for everybody. I just have a comment for you, Flora, which is that I've always been so drawn to the story of Ruth and Naomi, and I never quite knew why. I always saw it as this like pillar of like beautiful female friendship, just a like sign of deep relationship and beauty. But you really kind of stretched its implication in my own life and showed me like another reason why it's such a fabulous story to turn to. So thank you for that. Yeah, so wonderful.
Thank you. I don't have anything further to say to that, but me too. And I'm really grateful to be, praying with and reflecting on this passage in deeper ways with all of you today.
So I'm looking to see if any hands have come up. I myself don't have a question. I'm just like so awestruck. So feel free to raise your hands. Oh, Rosa, please. Sister Rosa. Or I'm so sorry. You are a Roman Catholic woman priest.
And don't call me Reverend either, or it's just Rosa.
Awesome. Hi, Rosa.
Rosa.
Hi.
Hello.
So, and your prayers, this whole thing was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I especially like the one, Blessed be God, because I love that prayer.
Yeah.
And it always felt like, but it's not inclusive. Well, you made it inclusive. It's great. When I thought of queer saints, two came to mind. I listed them in the chat, who are not queer though. They're heterosexual. And when I thought about it, I thought it's because, to me, saints, along with the description that you gave in the explanation, saints are saints because the image of God shines through them. You can see God peeking at us through their lives and actions. And as a mother of two lesbian daughters, and their father was gay also, I was told something several years ago when Francis was here, because I wanted to leave Philadelphia. It was horrible. The homophobia, the anti-gay attitude was horrible. I couldn't stand it. And I felt so guilty because I thought, I am going to walk out of a room that my children can never walk out of. That's wrong. That's wrong. But a friend was there and she told me, look, your children came out of the closet and they knew they had to. It was at that moment that whether you knew it or not, you came out of the closet as a parent of a gay child. And she said, it takes time. And those two women that I listed, one is still alive, Judy Shepard, and I think there she is, the mother of a gay child. And the other one, she was at the Pulse nightclub, and she shielded her son and died. I think they're saints.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really beautiful. I think sometimes when we've been reflecting on how queer people are images of God, right? But I think, like you rightfully mentioned, right, we also turn to the parents and family and the supporters of queer people, of their own mothers and fathers, and we're just so grateful for the many ways that their witness in their lives and their accompaniment also give us a new image of what God's love looked like as God the mother and the father and the parent, right?
And
So
and
thank you for sharing
what
that.
just one more thing, what I also think is important with those two women though, not though, but also what is important is that they did not put their heterosexuality as the center of everything. No, they are pushing their child to the center
Yeah. Amen.
so they can be seen, because that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to step out.
It's really beautiful. Thank you.
I see Madonna's hand if you want to hop on.
So I want to thank you, Flora, for this presentation. The action of reimagining and reclaiming stories that have been submerged is such an important tool for hope, and also to fight the ongoing oppression within the church. I think of the recent statements from the Pope that have been so homophobic, the teachings from the bishops that have been so full of homophobia, the anti-trans work that is going on in the church. And so this exercise, this truth that you presented to us and that we are finding is such an important tool for bringing hope and sustaining that hope in the face of such tremendous ongoing oppression in this patriarchal system.
Thank you so much. I think hope is what makes us keep going, right?
Daniel?
Hi, Flora. My name is Daniel. I'm Russ's husband, and I'm very happy to be here. I just wanted to share something that was sort of a cool little moment for me during the prayer part of your presentation, which was you were reading the portion of the scripture where they say, "Your people will be my people," and our queer little Catholic love story that we've got going on in our house means these people at this presentation and at these gatherings can sort of be my people because they are Russ's people. These are the people I hear about all the time who are constantly improving his life, constantly bringing wonderful things to him. I get to hear the stories all the time, but it's events like this where I get to show up. These people get to be my people. And I think that was just a really cool little moment that I had during the prayer, and I wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. And thank you to both you and Russ for also being my people tonight and hopefully in the future as well. Yeah.
That was so nice. Rita, I see your hand.
Thank you so much, Flora. Thank you very much. And Olivia, thank you for organizing this. I love the icon of the Asian woman who died by suicide, and I took a snapshot of it. Do you know who? I think you put the author of that icon there. Yes.
Yeah. Let me
Yes.
actually, I'm going to send you a link. Well, not just you, but like I'm going to send a link to the chat.
Okay.
When Father William Hart McNichols, who was the one who painted or wrote the icon, he was part of a really beautiful sort of interview reflection piece on outreach .faith, which is like a LGBTQ Catholic magazine. Highly recommend. Really,
Yeah.
a
I was
really
interested
beautiful story.
because my nephew, who was gay, well, almost died by suicide. So it's a very touching subject to me and my family. The other thing I wanted to offer, I'm the person who, the images of Mary Magdalene that you showed, the icon, I know the brother, I can get his name, but that was commissioned by the Episcopal woman, the Episcopal Church, in honor of the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women, which I found out later. The other thing I'd like to offer is the other image you showed of Mary Magdalene proclaiming, I commissioned that piece. And I would like to, I think you took a snapshot from my Instagram. It looks like you have the, so through Russ, I can, we'll send you a much better digital copy of that. And I would just ask that you give the attribution to the amazing Sister Margaret Baudet, a sister of charity. It's her second to last piece.
Wow.
She was about to do the series, the Stations of the Resurrection, but she became quite ill and wasn't able to. But
thank you.
But don't worry. We have the Stations of the Resurrection coming, hopefully at the end of July. So I just wanted to, so I'll get that to you through Russ.
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to post that in the chat as well with the artist name and
sure. Okay.
So we can all know what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm such a huge fan. I think I found both of them through Women's Ordination Conference, which I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with, and their Instagram and website. So yeah, thank you. That's amazing, and thank you for commissioning it.
Well, I'll just say, as a single heterosexual woman in the church, it's we're marginalized in our own way because many communities are just very uncomfortable with single women. And Mary Magdalene, who was a single woman at that stage of her life, first place, I was just so tired of seeing her on her knees. And there's only one gospel. In Matthew's gospel, she momentarily goes to her knees when Jesus surprises her and the other men. So anyhow, so that was the motivation, and it's just bloomed into this whole other career for me of commissioning art on Mary Magdalene. Okay, thank you. Enough other people.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the church often has one particular vision of family, right? And I am always grateful for images and prayers and reimaginations like you did of reimagining, I guess, affirming that Mary Magdalene was a single woman, and as ways of seeing that our presence, our different types of families are equally valid and important. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And you'll notice her hand is in the teaching position. That was the one thing I asked for Peggy and I also wanted Peter and his wife And and she just created all the other wonderful characters. Anyhow,
Yeah.
I have more information on that if you would like.
Great.
Take care. Thank you.
I don't see any more hands, but I would love to give more space to those who would like to offer a question or comment. I see so many words of celebration in the chat, so I'll just echo all of them, Flora. This really was so wonderful. But if there are any other questions people have or comments, we do have a little bit more time.
Yeah. Speaking as a very shy person, you're also welcome to type your comments or questions in the chat if you don't want to talk, which I totally understand. So, and I'm happy to read the questions out loud if they are. Oh, I see two hands.
Oh, good. That
I'll let
hands.
Olivia.
Oh, I'm muted. I see two hands. I think we'll start with, I hope I get this correct, Lalini.
Yes, that's correct, Olivia. Hi, Flora. Thank you so much for a really inspiring presentation. I was particularly taken by what you said about choosing our narratives in relation to imagining queer saints. And I was wondering, how do you see these chosen narratives having an impact on queer youth, especially people who might be in a position like Alana Chen? Do you think encouraging queer youth to choose those narratives or spreading them could help them in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely spot on, right? I think in faith formation and formation of our children and youth, so many of how we form people is what stories we tell them. And what stories we tell them shows them what kind of lives, what kind of worlds are possible, right? I think one not queer but related example is I think a lot of younger like kindergartner girls only see, say, like images in their little cute little kindergarten presentations of male doctors and male engineers. So these young girls don't see themselves as could possibly one day become a doctor or engineer, and so that's beginning to change, right? Where teachers are intentionally introducing images of like women who are doctors or women who are scientists, and that shapes a lot of how children see themselves and who they can be. So I think in similar ways, right, are getting to both being introduced to narratives of queerness and saying that, yes, you can imagine your own place in the history of the church is so important for young people to, first of all, feel empowered to be like, yes, this is my tradition too, and not just an authoritative or authoritarian thing that's handed to me by a priest. Yeah, but also to say that like our identities and our genders and sexualities are holy, are possible, and there are saints and holy people, whether living or dead, that we can emulate no matter who we are, to be faithful, to be, yeah, to be filled with works of mercy and justice, in the ways that we live on our faith. So I think you're absolutely spot on.
Thank you, Flora. It's really encouraging to hear. Good luck with the rest of your doctoral program also.
Thank you.
And then Leslie, I see your hand.
Thank you. Flora, hi.
Hi, Leslie.
I think that for me, the power of your talk is that you invited us to reimagine. And I think that's at the heart of the gospel, just the freedom to ask questions, to ponder, to wonder, what if this was different somehow? We have the translations because Jesus didn't speak English, and so we've got all these different translations. But also the writing style of 2,000 years was not the same as it is today as far as details, what's considered significant. And so I appreciate the invitation that you offered for us to reimagine, to reconsider. And I think that that is just in itself is a gift, because even after the program ends, you've planted that seed. So thank you.
Thank you. I am out of words to respond to that because you just put it so beautifully. I'm sure I have many things to say if given more time. But yeah, I think reimagining is, for me, just a deep act of faith and hope, right? In that, something is possible, and that something different and something that is submerged, something that was there but forgotten. So we reimagine our histories and our presence, and our futures too, right, as a church. Yeah, so thank you so much for reminding all of us of that.
And I appreciate the use of the word submerged, because that covers a lot of sins that have been, covered by colonizers and those in power.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
thanks.
Flora, I know you can't read the chat, right?
Oh, I can read it now. I just couldn't read it when I was
Oh.
sharing screen.
Okay. So Creating Change has a group of leaders in different religious traditions, and we meet in a place called the Many Paths Rooms. And I have to tell you, in all of these years, there have been crickets as far as Roman Catholics are concerned. Priests do not show up. I'm the priest that has shown up. I think if you could do a presentation like this at Creating Change, it would be so beneficial. There are so many recovering Catholics, former Catholics, cultural Catholics, hell no, anything but a Catholics over there. But the word is Catholic. And when I've done masses, they come because they want that, but they haven't been given the language, or they don't know the language. They've been made to feel uninvited, and they aren't invited. And I think you would be such a beautiful light for them.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, we are coming towards the close of our time here, and Flora, thank you so very much for this really moving presentation, an invitation. Really, Leslie captured it so beautifully, what the power of your presentation was. I can't go on for too long, except to say that your blessing at the end just washed over me. Thank you for that. And yes, we'll make sure we can share that with everyone. And I do want to thank Olivia so much for doing such a terrific job of bringing this Pride Month series together and bringing us into contact with some really fantastic thinkers and amazing people. So thank you so much, Olivia, for all of your hard work and energy and passion on this.